Hi, everyone. We're going to get started now. Welcome to this webinar with Nick Mehta from Gainsight. Nick, we are super thrilled to have you with us here today. I'm sure all of you, Nick doesn't really need an introduction, but just for background, Nick is the CEO of Gainsight, which is the leading customer success management company. He has decades of experience in senior leadership positions at a number of enterprise companies. Prior to Gainsight, he was an entrepreneur in residence at Excel Partners. He served as CEO of Live Office and has had senior leadership roles in other companies like Symantec and Veritas. He's an absolute guru when it comes to sales. And this webinar in particular is going to focus on how to up-level from selling to SMB clients to enterprise-level clients. So before we get started, just want to lay out some ground rules. So if you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A feature. So at any point during the presentation, if you have any questions, we encourage you to chat them to us in that Q&A function, and we'll be collecting all the questions, and we'll have about 20 minutes at the end of the webinar for Nick to answer your questions. So don't be shy, ask any questions you have. And with that, Nick, I will hand it over to you. Yeah, thank you so much again for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks so much to all of you for joining, and thanks to the Endeavor team for hosting this. I'm really honored to be here. That introduction was far too kind, so thank you. I don't know if I'm a guru on anything, but I definitely can share some things we've been through at Gainsight, and also just honestly have a dialogue with you, and I'm sure I'll learn just as much from all of you as you might take away from this. So I've prepared some slides about basically what we've gone through in the process of trying to move up market as a company. So in case you don't know Gainsight, we're a company that's coming up on about 500 employees, a growth stage software as a service company. I'll tell you a little bit about what we do in a second, but the challenge we've gone through is that we had a market where we could sell to very small companies and we could sell to very large companies, and we had interest from all of them. And we had to make some decisions about, do we spread our chips everywhere, sell to everyone? Do we go up market? And we went up market and have had some success as part of that, but also some learning. So kind of wanted to share all of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the slides. So it'll probably take 15, 20 minutes. And then as we're going through, feel free to put your questions in the chat window. And then hopefully most of the discussion can be just actual questions based on anything related to sales or market segmentation or moving up market. So what I'll cover in my presentation, I'll do a real quick intro on kind of Gainsight and who I am and why I'm passionate about what we do. But then what I'll dive into is the idea of like why we decided to go up market, how we segmented our market. I think it's something a lot of companies are going through nowadays. They're thinking about their customers as being different, big versus small, and they're trying to focus in the right areas. I'll talk about what our actual segmentation ended up being, and that's kind of evolving as we go, actually, and I'll talk about that. We'll talk about what we learned by looking at the data. We actually looked at our adoption data, our net promoter score, which is kind of customer satisfaction data, and basically use that to build our segmentation. I'll talk about kind of what we learned through this process, and honestly, the fact that it just keeps going. We're changing it again a little bit, so I'll talk about that, then we'll do Q&A. So with that, let me dive in. So I do believe that every company, probably all of yours as well, the great companies are formed based on personal passion. You got to be irrationally passionate about what you do, and I'm passionate about what we do at Gainsight. My story about kind of Gainsight actually starts from when I was a little kid. This actually be probably 10, 12 years old, with my dad actually in the East Coast of the US in Pennsylvania. My dad was an entrepreneur and CEO of some companies. And back when my dad was running companies, his experience and what he told me when I was a kid was that the only thing that matters in business is sales and getting new customers. And nothing else really matters. It's just about sales. And, in the early days of my career, a lot of the companies I worked in kind of reinforced that. It was really just about sales. The customer didn't have a lot of power. And then I went to run my first SaaS business, my first subscription business about, I guess, 8, 9 years ago now. And it was the first time my customer had a lot of power, and I had to focus not just on sales, but also making sure those customers were successful and stayed with us. And that's kind of what the mission is at Gainsight. At Gainsight, we're all about this idea that there's this new movement that we call customer success, which many of you probably have on your teams. It's a new function, but it's also a new way to think about your business, where it's not just about selling new customers, but it's about making sure the customers you get value, adopt your service, and then ideally stay with you and grow over time. And the best evidence of this taking off is this conference we do every year called Pulse, which is this event we do that brings together people in the customer success movement. Everyone from CEOs, probably some of the folks on the call were at the conference, as well as individuals in the CS function coming together to learn about how to drive success for clients. And so at Gainsight, we think our mission is about driving customer success. And then to build a business, we build a software product that kind of runs on the Salesforce platform and helps people basically manage customers from onboarding through adopting their service, through kind of growing in value and ideally renewing and staying with you over time. We also done a lot of stuff to educate people on customer success. We wrote a book on it. We run local educational forums. But again, I don't want to talk too much about Gainsight. That just gives you a little context. But from a business perspective, fundamentally we're a SaaS company. So we sell a product that is sold fundamentally based on the number of users, probably similar to some of yours. We can sell to small companies. We can sell to large companies. We've got lots of customers, small to large. And so we have this challenge of who do we sell to, just like probably a lot of you do. And then we've got kind of the way we sell, which is we sell in a very consultative way. We don't sell based on features. We sell based on business processes. And I'm not going to go through these in detail, but we talk about with Gainsight, you can drive different business processes, managing risk in your customer base, driving expansion, giving everyone in your company visibility into your customers, things like that. So that's important to know as we talk about segmentation, because we started out with a value prop that was very business aligned and not just a feature. And frankly, I think that's what forced us to move up market, because when you sell to really small companies, they often need really quick tools that don't take a lot of explanation. But you go up market and people want to buy business processes. And so we decided to go up market. We also had a lot of success, which I'll talk more about, with larger customers, even going into this process. So you can see we work with a lot of large SaaS companies, a lot of large tech companies, big industrial companies like GE, if you've heard of them as well. And within our market, we've been kind of recognized as the leader in what we do. So let's dive into the topic of the presentation, which is really what have we learned by moving up market and how do we approach it? So let me start actually with the why. That's the most important thing. So I was sitting in probably many board meetings actually over the course of a few years, but I remember a board meeting probably 2.5 years ago. And one of my board members really thought that we needed to move up market. He thought the opportunity is really in big companies, small customers churn a lot, they go out of business. And so, from the board, I had this sort of interest in moving up market. Within our customer base, I had everyone from super small companies saying, can I buy Gainsight, to really big companies, right? I had people in my company saying, I love selling to startups. I had people I was selling to big companies. I had my product management team being asked to, at the same time, make our product simpler and make it more sophisticated, right? Which to some extent is actually really challenging. And so I think all of us felt like, gosh, like we are just spinning from one thing to another, going from like a call with a 10-person company to talking to a 10,000-person company, right? And we were just being pulled in every direction. I don't know if you feel like that or not, but for us, we felt like we need to do a better job of even just understanding who we're selling to, and also having a language around it. Like even if we decide to sell to multiple segments, let's be able to talk about those segments in a consistent way. And that's one thing I think we've been able to do pretty successfully, which I'll talk about. So we had this backdrop over a few years of being pulled in lots of directions. And then I think about 1.5 years ago, we basically said, we need to kind of rethink how we approach this. We had a board meeting. We'd gotten some feedback about just kind of being spread too thin. We were doing really well with our large customers. So we came back to the board and said, okay, we're going to segment our business. We're going to divide it up. And so we approach this pretty thoughtfully, I think. We're pretty geeky in our company. So everything we do, we try to think pretty deeply about. And we tried to think about, okay, if we wanted to divide our market up, what would we use to figure out how to divide it up? I know that sounds kind of like an easy question. Many people just say, oh, based on employees or revenue, you kind of segment your customers. But we actually said, let's be thoughtful about it. And we kind of said, okay, there's different ways you can segment. We thought of it as sort of, if you've heard the terms before, ex ante segmentation. That means things that you can segment without knowing a lot about the customer. In other words, you might get a lead and be able to figure out, is this a small company or big company? And the great thing about that is everyone in the company can align around segmentation, whether it's marketing or sales. Or you can segment based on like what they've done with you. We consider that ex post segmentation. For example, what package they bought from you, right? Did they buy the enterprise package or the SMB package? But the downside to that is when they're a lead, you don't know what kind of package they're going to buy. So we decided we wanted an ex ante segmentation, something that we can know beforehand. And so we said, let's find something that we can use to segment our base and then move up market based on that. So the second thing we said was, in an ideal world, if we were segmenting, we would know everything about the customer. We would know, what CRM system they use. Do they have a customer success team? Are they profitable? Do they have venture capital? But it's really hard to get all that data about your prospects, right? And so we said, what's the variable that we call kind of a proxy variable, meaning it's something that we could say correlates to a lot of these other variables. And we thought about different variables. Now, funnily enough, we came back to the same thing everyone else does. So maybe we overthink it. We should have just copied everyone else. But we ended up coming to the idea that employees is the right measure for us. We felt like in our business, the bigger employee companies had more complexity. So there was more complexity in deployment. There was also a lot more value we could deliver for them because they had more revenue. There was more to retain. We felt employees was an objective metric, right? You could have other things that were more subjective. Maybe the salesperson says, this is a good fit, this one's not, but that's not very objective. And it was easy to get employee data, especially for big companies. The downside, there's some little downsides. We said, well, if we segment by employees, one downside is it changes a lot. And we actually run into this now where a customer used to be a small company, but now over a couple of years, they're now a mid-sized company. Also, some companies have lots of employees, but not much revenue, a services company, for example, or a retailer. And other companies might have a small number of employees and lots of revenue, like Facebook, right? And so that's the downside. But we basically said employees kind of make sense. We then said, let's find the breakpoints if we want to segment where things are kind of discontinuous. So if you think of like a curve, and on the y-axis, it's sort of the value the company gets and maybe the effort we have to put in. The x-axis is employees. Where is it non-linear? So that's kind of the question. That's where we wanted to segment by. And so again, like I said, we think this stuff perhaps a little too much. And so what we kind of came up with, and I think we really believe this, is the value and effort is discontinuous, meaning it kind of breaks when the org structure of our prospects breaks. So for Gainsight, at least, we feel like we need to align to when their org structure changes. And so if it's a simple org structure, that's going to be simple sale. If it's a complex org structure, complex sale. And we then started mapping out. We said, okay, if we sell to a really small company, let's say it's a 10-person company, maybe some people on the call like this, right? The truth is, they're probably very small. They don't have a lot of funding, not a lot of customers. They may not perceive a lot of value in Gainsight, honestly, because they don't have a lot of customers, right? They may want some basic features from Gainsight, maybe tracking adoption of their customers that are early. They probably don't have an executive for customer success. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but you can see that we mapped out, okay, what happens when there's another level in the organization? They probably have a VP of sales. They've got a little bit of funding. They may want a little bit more features from Gainsight. And then we said, okay, well, when they add another level to the organization, that might be some of the people on the call. I have a VP of customer success. I've got directors. They probably just started using Salesforce if they use a CRM. They might have 5 to 15 CSMs. So the nice thing about this, you could probably do something similar, is we came up with these personas of the different segments and what we think about them and what we suspect they're like and how to talk to them. And then we kind of did the same thing as you get bigger, maybe now it's a few 100-person company and they have more mature Salesforce.com. They've got kind of more venture capital. And then now you get to a bigger company where they have multiple business units, right? And so you can follow the kind of logic here. And so we basically mapped out different kind of levels of segmentation. And then what we did was we said, okay, based on all that, who do we want to sell to and what segments do we want to sell to? And we actually did some simple math. This math actually ended up changing a little bit, but essentially we said, look, a 2-level organization, that first one I showed you, meaning like kind of just a small startup, is likely to be between 2 and 8 employees. And it's simple kind of graph theory, right? Like you have one top of the node and how many children in the node. And we said, well, average company is probably 7 employees per manager. And so the table here is purely mathematical. And we basically said, okay, let's, based on math, build like our segmentation. Now, over time, we adapted this sort of employee to manager ratio. So the numbers changed a little bit. But conceptually, basically said there's different levels of organizations and there's different segments we can sell to. And then we rounded those up a little bit. So we kind of changed 2801 to 3000 just to make it easier to remember. And so these ended up being our first segmentation. So we said, okay, there's companies with 2 to 10 employees, 11 to 100, 101 to 400, and so on, right? And so that was sort of like everyone we could sell to. That's how we sort of, at least came up with the grounding for what we could do. Now, we're definitely geek in Gainsight, as you can already tell. And I'm also really in space and astronomy and physics and things like that. And so since I'm CEO, I get to name things. And I was like, I want to make these names not just like SMB, mid-market, because that's super boring. And so we basically decided to name them after planets, and we actually named our customer segments. So we said, okay, a 2 to 10 person companies like Pluto. There's a little bit of a joke because the companies that are that small are still trying to prove whether they're really a company. And as you know, Pluto is not actually a planet anymore. And then Mercury, which is 11 to 100, are these fast-moving young companies, and then Mars, which is we call the next segment Mars because we're kind of in the same zone as them, and so assuming we're on Earth in this sort of crazy analogy, then the Mars companies are a lot like us, and then Venus and Jupiter. And so basically we came up with these names, and I got to say, like, one of the most successful things is we just branded our personas, and then internally everyone knows how to talk to each other, which is really, really cool. And then we'll talk about how that allowed us to move up market. We then did some analysis. We said, okay, if I use those segments, and I've done all that work to figure out the segments, how does our business break down? And so this was as of like a year and a half ago when we did this analysis. So, we had most of our revenue in Venus, in AR, the left chart's ARR, annual recurring revenue, and then Mars, and then Mercury, Jupiter. But then if you looked at our pipeline, a lot of our growth was coming in Jupiter and Venus. And long term, when we did our what we call total addressable market, meaning who could we sell to, most of our business would come in Jupiter than Venus. So you could see the business was sort of naturally shifting from small companies to large companies. This was before we did the segmentation. We were like, oh, wow, that's interesting. Then we said, let's look at where we're most successful, not just selling, but actually driving value. And of course, for Gainsight, that's important. That's kind of what we do. So which customers are most successful? So we actually use our own product. We in Gainsight, we do things like track Net Promoter Score, which is a measure of satisfaction, and we track adoption and all that. And so in our own instance of our own product, we ran some reports. And the first one we looked at was Net Promoter Score by planet. So we said, which planets are the most happy with Gainsight? What's kind of interesting was our largest customers, this is last year, were the most happy with Gainsight. You can see these are actual numbers. If Net Promoter Score goes from 0 to 100, 20 is okay, 40 is pretty good, 60 is very good. If you're at 80, just count your lucky stars. And so with Jupiter, we were doing really well. The big companies, Venus, were doing pretty well. And you can see it was kind of a trend line. So that was quite interesting. The second thing we did was we looked at our adoption. And we basically, in Gainsight, use our own product to measure how our clients are using our service. We color code them. Are they green, lime, orange, red, yellow? And so it's just sort of a ranking of kind of how they're doing. And then we measure the percentage that are green or lime. That's sort of our own internal analysis. Now, this is kind of interesting because the smallest customers were using us the most, but the biggest customers were the happiest. That was kind of funny. Now, some of that's because big companies take a while to roll things out, and they might buy a ramping contract where over time they roll things out. So I wouldn't read too much into this, but that was kind of interesting to look at. And then we looked at our renewal rates by segment. Now, because we weren't that big of a business at the time, we not all of this was super meaningful because any one part of the quadrant wasn't always that big. But we looked at our renewal rates. We found Jupiter clients were upselling a lot. So they were starting and staying, but also growing fast. And over time, we found, probably not surprisingly, Jupiter renews the highest, then Venus, then Mars, then Mercury. And that's consistent to today. So then what we basically did was we said, actually, before we go to learnings, we said, okay, we're going to focus on the places where we have the happiest customers and the best renewal rates. And so we said, we're going to focus a lot on Jupiter, really invest in that. We added tons to that team. We're going to really try to do a great job in Venus. We're going to try to maintain Mars, but we didn't grow it as much as the other segments. And we actually cut off and said, we're not going to sell to people less than 100 employees anymore. So because we felt we were going to be more successful the further up we went. And the data was relatively consistent about that. And then what we did was we created virtual teams. So we actually had a virtual team for Jupiter, which was salespeople, customer success people, marketing, services, product management. We had a virtual team for Venus. We had a virtual team for Mars. They made t-shirts. They had offsites. They had training. I mean, it was really, really cool. And so very good bonding because, we're 500 people now and you need to create all these little pockets of sort of teamwork. So overall, big success. Jupiter's grown a ton. Venus has done okay. I think that's less about the segment and more about the business. And the Mars has done actually quite well. And we're now reinvesting in Mars because it's actually become very performant for us. So it's been a great exercise. Now, interesting enough, I'll talk more about this. Now that our product has sort of become more scalable and our business is more scalable, we're starting to sell to Mercury again. So kind of things keep evolving. But the segmentation allowed us to have good language about this, talk to our board about how we're doing. They were very happy that Jupiter became a big focus for us, things like that. So I would encourage you to think about like how you segment, but also how you name things and how you actually get people excited about different parts of the business in a very personal. So let me talk a little bit about some of the learning. So overall, it's a very big success, one of the best things we've done. I do think, what we figured out, funnily enough, is we may have over-segmented. So I actually think we may have like divided things up too much and we're kind of consolidating things a little bit now. That does create some complexity in the business. We actually didn't spend enough time on Mars and Mercury. And frankly, that was a mistake on our part. And now we're investing in that. It's actually doing quite well. We grew a lot in the Jupiter segment, which is great. One thing to know as you move up market, sales cycles take longer. So frankly, it was overall great, but actually much more bumpy. Our sales became much more kind of bumpy and less predictable, which is probably not surprising, right? But overall, I think, the Jupiter clients are super happy. They're actually doing really well. They're growing. They've got tons of them. We've become really dominant in that market. Our Mars clients are doing really well. And so overall, I think this stuff has really paid off. But I think you kind of live and learn. So we're actually changing the segments. We're actually expanding Mars to go from not just to 400 employees, but to 800 now because it's done really well. We're expanding Venus. So things will keep moving, but the fact that we had segments and thought about moving up market is one of the best things we've ever done. So just, I'll kind of jump into Q&A in a second. If you want to learn more about Gainsight and customer success, we've actually got a little link here. You can click to it. There's a pretty good little ebook on kind of Gainsight and customer success and churn. But I want to kind of do some Q&A about moving up market because that was just my story, and each of you have a story as well. So let me stop sharing and let's go to the chat window. And if people can put questions into the chat window, I'd love to answer them. And by the way, I've got a couple that people ask me about, independent of this, and I'll kind of start with those, and then as people put them in, please just type them into the window. So one question that I get a lot is, how do I pass up opportunity? That was like one of my biggest concerns. Like we stopped selling to people under 100 employees. We focused on the bigger customers. That's like the hardest thing psychologically because I didn't want to not win a customer anywhere. I wanted to get all the customers, right? And so my ego was like, I don't want to stop selling anywhere. Now, I think the reality is we all kind of rationalize that we want to sell where we're doing better, especially where we have better NPS. And so we felt good about this decision, but like was a struggle for me. I think people had internally and externally kind of concerns about why we're passing things up. And we had friends at some of these startups that we would no longer sell to. And so that was something that I think is just a challenge you have to sort of get your head around, and you have to lead from the front. The first question I got here, and please keep typing them in, was from Robert. Thanks, Robert. How do you sell that internally? And I think that that's something that I put a lot of thought into, the change management around this, where we actually announced this segmentation. We announced the names of the planets. We made like a little, if you remember from school, the solar system model, we made those in different offices. We made t-shirts. We got people excited about it. And it actually, one benefit to talk about is it allowed the mid-level people to create their own leadership teams. So there was like a Jupiter leadership team without any executives on it. There was a Venus leadership team, and there's without executives on it. And so I think one way we sold it to people internally is this allowed people to really step up and become leaders within the company. A second thing is I think we weren't doing great in customer success in the sub 100. So, we talked about the fact that this Mercury segment under 100, we're like, we're not doing great there. We have a decent amount of churn. We're creating ill will for the clients that churn. is that a good idea? And I think people really appreciated that we were honestly like making a decision that was customer centric. Like, we're not going to sell to you because we're not a good fit. Nowadays, as our product has gotten better, we've, like I mentioned, we've kind of moved down and said, okay, we'll sell to people in the upper end of Mercury, basically 50 employees and higher. And so we're starting to go back to that segment. But I think people internally felt like, okay, wow, Gainsight is making a decision in the interest of customers, like not selling to people that would give us their money because we don't think we're going to be a good fit. So actually that plus the branding of Planets really helped us resonate. So that was Robert's question. The next question was, we'll get the presentation material for sure. We'll send it to you. The next question is, Martin says, thanks for your time. I know that your solution is not for small companies. How do you decide that and why? So basically, going back to my analysis, our NPS was better the bigger the companies we had. Our renewal rates were better the bigger the company we had. So we had all this data. But then on top of that, we just knew our solution was complex. There was a multi-week onboarding. You needed an administrator to manage it. Now, over time, it's become more simple, but we knew that a really small company couldn't get a lot of value out of it. Also, by the way, it costs a decent amount. We charge roughly starting at about $50,000 a year, right? 50,000 a year. So, for a small company, that's a lot of money. So we were selling to some small companies that really shouldn't have been buying it. And we're like, we need to be more responsible and not sell to them. And that's how we decided. The next next question is from Alakan27, who says, I think the proxy is a great idea. What factors are important to determine the proxy? In your case, can you go deeper into why employees was the right metric? For sure. You have to figure out some variable. And for me, the starting point is if you want to make it ex ante, meaning something you can segment on before you talk to the customer, it has to be something that's in all the data sets that are out there. So you probably get lists of potential customers. Those lists have employees, they have potentially revenue, industry, things like that. So there's not a lot of data, honestly. There's not a lot of good data out there. So there weren't a ton of variables. For us, it was probably either going to be revenue or employees. We thought that because Gainsight is a solution that's about change management and process, not just about revenue. In other words, it helps your team drive success for your clients. It's a team-oriented solution that employees was fundamentally more aligned to the value. And the analysis I did about org structures, where as the company's org structure changed, the complexity changed, that really resonated for us. But I think if you were a business where you were more, let's say you were a business that was just generating, leads or something, right? And it was tied to revenue more directly, I could see you segmenting based on revenue. So I think it has to be tied to how your business works. The next question from Alex. These are awesome questions. Is your pricing for Jupiter different than Mars? A great question. I didn't talk about this. With the segmentation, one of the things that allowed us to do is really think about each segment differently. Because in large companies, honestly, they're not as price sensitive. And in fact, they're okay with complex pricing because they want to be able to adjust and negotiate. And so our pricing for Jupiter is both higher, but also intentionally more complex, more features, more options. And so Mars is much simpler, and that's exactly right. And that allowed us to do that. Next question, Alcon27. A second question, in larger enterprises, is it harder to get to the decision maker? Yeah. So I haven't talked at all about selling to these other segments, right? So the large enterprise segment is complex, long sales cycles. Our sales cycles are 9 months to a year, but the deals are, in US dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to millions of dollars a year. So, good value, right? We have for Jupiter, the large accounts, a field sales team. They're in the meaning they're in the regions. They're meeting the customers face to face. We're doing events that we invite senior executives to. We have a big conference that we bring. So the events, actually, I think broadly speaking, are probably the best way to get to decision maker in general. Is getting them to events versus just trying to go, cold email them or do a webinar. We also use influencers. So today we're mainly selling in the US and England, sort of in Western Europe. And there's some consulting firms that are very popular. You probably have heard of McKinsey. You might have heard of Accenture. And so we're partnering with some of those who can help us get to decision makers as well. Next question. Can the education industry work on the same concept? I don't fully, this is from Hardest, I don't fully understand the questions. You can probably put a clarification, but if you're saying, can companies that sell into the education market use a similar concept? I think so. I'm not an expert on education, but I'd imagine there is a natural segmentation. Whether it's in schools, based on school size, based on the number of sites and the complexity. I have friends who sell into education, and they've been segmenting in a similar way. So they actually have been segmenting large school district, small school district, large university, small university. They've been focusing more on large versus small. If you have a complex solution, it might work better for larger versus small. One of the biggest mistakes in general, which informed the interest in this presentation, was I just see so many companies spread their chips everywhere, just sell to everyone and not be able to have a good discussion about where their focus is. I sometimes talk to entrepreneurs and I say, who do you sell to? And they say, well, we sell to kind of a mix, small companies, large companies, domestic and international. We sell to people in, a bunch of different industries, a lot of different decision makers. I'm like, well, how do you focus? How do you have a conversation with product management about who your persona is? Next question is from Eric in Brazil. Can you please talk about the product? How was your sales effort to adapt the product in order to support your different customers' profile? Our product, just to give you a little more detail, is a SaaS product. It integrates with CRM systems like Salesforce. It basically brings in data that companies have about their customers. There's a sort of a big data integration piece that will pull in like product usage data or customer support data, and then also with the data in CRM. And then it'll help you basically analyze the customers to figure out which ones are healthy, which ones aren't, and then manage the workflow from the time they buy through onboarding, through getting them to adopt, helping you decide which customers are at risk, which ones are doing well, helping you run playbooks to make those customers more successful, literally automating the emails to those customers. So it's a pretty comprehensive solution. And so, I think the question is, how did our sales effort to adapt the product support different customers' profiles? And that's a great question, because if you talk to our Mercury customers, the smallest, or Pluto, and you talk to our Jupiter, they would want different things. The Jupiter customers wanted, probably no surprise, complex security, roles-based administration, partner integration, things like that, right? And the small companies were like, gosh, it takes way too long to set up Gainsight. Can I do it without an administrator? Can I make it easier to use? By the way, we want to do all those things too, right? So we had the sort of requirements from both sides, but they were very, very different, And one of the things we ended up seeing was we would do a new release, right? And we have a big engineering team, like 200 people in R&D, and we do a new release. We'd be so excited about it, right? And there's all these new features that do so many different things. And then our small customers would be like, God, this is overwhelming. And our big customers like, this is amazing, right? The same stuff. And so we basically realized the product needs were quite different. Over time, I actually could imagine us having a different package altogether for Mercury and Mars, maybe a different product. This segmentation has allowed us to think very creatively. Do you change your price based on, this is from Alex, based on a prospect's ability to pay? So it's being recorded. I'm just joking. So I think the way that enterprise pricing works, it generally is there's a lot of levers to it. You have different features, you have different bundles, different services. And I think fundamentally that allows a vendor to have a discussion with a customer and align to their ability to pay. So the reason enterprise pricing often is complex is you're trying to fit into whatever ability to pay they have, and they also want to negotiate a lot. And so because of that, our Jupiter pricing has a lot of pieces to it versus our Mars Mercury pricing. We're trying to make it a little bit simpler. So yes, we align it on ability to pay, but probably more directly based on complexity. We have time for some more questions. So any more?
So Nick, there's actually a few questions in the Q&A function. So if you just scroll to the bottom of the screen here, there's a question from Salim asking, if you would restart selling to SMEs again, what would you change in terms of sales process? Would you go deep in their killer pains, or would you add a broader business solution for them?
Great. We probably will at some point. In fact, we're starting to sell to kind of the high end of SMEs, like 50 employees and higher. And a few things that we are doing and probably would go deeper into. So number one, delimiting some of the features in the product to make it easier to buy subsets. For example, one of the things Gainsight can do is customer surveys, and we do them really well now. And a lot of small companies want to use them, and so we want to be able to let them buy just that. That's number one. Number two, having various onboarding options, which are maybe more like on-demand onboarding and things like that, things that are a little more flexible. Number three, for the sales team, having demos and packages that are a little bit more focused. Like our product can do everything, right? And so when we get into a demo, we often just are like, let me show you this and this and this, and it's awesome, right? We're so proud of it. But that's a lot of overwhelming for the small companies. So I think there's a lot of things you can do to almost unbundle and simplify marketing, sales, et cetera. On top of that, I think over time, I can imagine us saying, are there things we'd want to buy, companies we'd want to buy to sell to this SMB solution, maybe add-on solutions, things like that. I'll go to the next question. Ahmed asked, we applied the same concept 6 months ago. We're still having a problem forecasting, managing the pipeline to enterprise. Oh my God, that's so resonant with us. And it's still hard. I think that one of the biggest things that we've gone through, maybe if I gave you a couple things that we've seen. Number one, you can't forecast it like SMB. So it's not just based on like the number of leads and things like that. It really is based on the deals themselves, so about the deals and the stages and all that. Number two, I think you need the right type of salespeople who are focused on enterprise. So we have I didn't mention this explicitly. We have a sales team focused on Jupiter, one focused on Venus, one on Mars. And the people that you hire that are more field salespeople, that's what they do. They're kind of organized, good about that. And then because we're so focused on kind of larger customers, we hired an enterprise sales leader, a chief revenue officer just recently, he's all about that. So some of this is about the team that you bring in. Some of it is we forecast differently SMB versus enterprise. SMB is a numbers game. Enterprise is a names game. Names meaning like it's about the deals. Beyond that, I think another thing is in the enterprise, if they're big deals, honestly, like I know a lot of the customers, excuse me. So it helps that I have a sense of it. And as a CEO, I have a sense of like, does it feel like they're ready to buy and things like that. So next question. Can you share some tips on how to establish a relation with the consultants to take you to the decision makers? And it says, thanks a lot, great session. So yes, I have to admit, if you cold emailed a consultant and said, hey, I've got this great new solution, love to talk to you, I don't think you get any traction for bigger ones. What ends up happening is you end up being in a client and they're there too, and they see dollars. And so one of the things we've been able to do is Cisco, for example, is a big Gainsight customer, and they're a big Accenture customer. And we did an expansion of Gainsight at Cisco, and we said, hey, Accenture, you can do the implementation. And that was a big deal for them. And that allowed them to get some business and then actually them to expand and now bring us into other deals. Another example is when you do events, invite them to speak. So when we do our conferences, we invite McKinsey, Accenture, Deloitte, BCG, et cetera, to speak. And so that gives them a chance to market. So I think it's hard to go to them and say, can you introduce me to your clients? You've got to almost give them something first. So many questions here, so I'm just keep going. How do you design compensation for your team around renewals and closing new deals? So that's probably a more general question, not just about segmentation. Generally speaking, one decision is, are you going to have a hunter-farmer model where different people do new deals versus renewals? Or are you going to have a model where the same rep does both? In our top segments, the same rep does renewals and new business because it's all tied together, and there's a lot of upsell in Jupiter. In Mars, it's a kind of hunter-farmer model. There's a sales rep who does the new deal and the account manager who does the renewal. Okay, so that's the first piece. In Venus, by the way, we had the sales rep do the new business and the renewal, but we're now moving the renewal to an account manager. So that'll change as you go. But then in terms of compensation, what we've generally found in industry average is you're going to end up having a quota, for how much you expect them to do. Let's say it's an ACV, and then you've got their what they call on-target earnings, meaning how much commission do they expect to earn at quota, and the division of those two is their commission. And so you pay them some commission, and then if they're above that commission rate, if above their quota, their commission rate usually goes up. That's called an accelerator. Now the rates for new business might be, depending on the quota, anything from 7-8% to 10-12%. The rates for renewals might be anything from 1-2% to 3-4%. So it should be a lot less for renewals because they should be easier. What planet do you think education falls into? Great question. So to be honest, I haven't sold directly to education. And I know it's a totally different world. So I hate to try to opine on things that I'm not an expert on. But if I kind of gave you some thoughts The challenge with education is I think it's like in some ways like small companies often price sensitive, and then in some ways like large companies often complex. So I think that you have a little bit of both. But I do think that friends of mine who sell in the education market, you've got to find a way to cost effectively serve it. So to me, it looks more like Mercury and Pluto than it does like Jupiter or Venus, at least speculating. So I'll go on to the next one from Ahmed. Thanks. That said, we're happy with, so this is a follow-up question. That said, we're happy with the overall results. I think Ahmed implements segmentation. We're considering selling only to enterprise, even in verticals, since we don't have resources to go across all segments. I mean, I think making decisions like that is a good idea. I don't know your business at all, but I think being willing to say we're only going to sell to these folks is a good idea in general. That's kind of what we've done. It's much, much worse to say we're selling to everyone. So I don't know anything beyond this, but I think it's worth considering. How do you move, the next question from Eduardo, how do you move customers, free users to paid without sales team? That, by the way, again, an area I'm not an expert on because we don't have a freemium type model. I do know that a lot of people have really implemented very automated nurture through email and also through in-app things like Intercom, if you guys use that, to really try to drive that free to paid. If you heard a company called Atlassian, which makes Jira, they're the experts on this. So I'm not an expert, but I do think that there's companies that have done it well. Next question, Eduardo says, in the product demo, you should sell features or benefits. That's an awesome question. I actually think that that's another way segmentation helps. As you're in the more Mercury, Mars segment, more SMB, I personally think people buy features. And as you go up, they buy benefits. And they buy actually not just benefits, but they buy like processes and strategies. And so the further down you are, the more it's about the feature function. The further up you are, it's about process. And your demo really should change. Next question, do you graduate SMB reps to enterprise? You guys are asking all the great questions. Or is the sales process so different that you don't? So we tried graduating SMB reps to enterprise. And for us, the gap was too big. It didn't work. So we hire in enterprise reps. And maybe over time, SMB reps, if they stay a long time, can grow. But for us, it's just too different. So, and I've seen other people have that same problem. Next question from Alican27. Third question, as you mentioned, sales process way longer. How do you compensate sales reps when they're in that 9 to 12 months of no commission drought? Great question. So ideally, you've got upsell in those existing accounts. That's why I think in large enterprise, upsell is important. So ideally, it's not 9 to 12 months forever. So frankly, a lot of our new reps are doing really good, doing really well by upselling. And so they're making a lot of money just in the early days. So that's number one. Number two, smart sales reps, when they're negotiating their contracts, some of them will ask for something called a draw. A draw is basically saying they're going to get paid either all or some of their commission, no matter whether they sell or not, for some short period of time. 3 months is very common. I think you have to sometimes do that to get the right reps. One thing that's funny about enterprise sales is being cheap on compensation is the worst possible thing you can do. So one of the struggles you might deal with is these enterprise salespeople make a lot of money. In the US, I'm not sure how this is throughout the world. Enterprise salespeople in a really good year can make $1 million or more. And that's hard to take because nobody else in the company could make that much, right? Besides stock, nobody else can make that much. But the truth is that those people are the ones that really drive business. And there's such a big difference, probably very much like engineering, between the sort of like average and the best. Don't go cheap on compensation in enterprise sales. The next one is how to choose a good sales manager. Great question. When you talk to people who are experienced sales leaders in enterprise, they say the most important job is actually the manager, not even the rep. So it's not the VP, it's not the rep, it's actually the manager. The manager's coaching, the manager's actually training. We've learned a lot. We've actually had some good ones and some ones that didn't work out that are really nice people but just weren't effective. What we've found is in enterprise, if that's where the kind of question is, and I'll also answer for SMB, in the sort of Jupiter world that we have, we think it's a few things. Number one, somebody who's very strategic. They need to really understand how to think about large companies and navigate them. They need to have great executive presence because they're often meeting with the executives. So, the sales rep might meet with the lower level people. The manager might meet with the executives. Number three, they need to be great at recruiting. And one test is like, who's going to follow them to their next company? If they came to your company, I would ask them in the interview, who's going to follow you from your last company? If they don't have people, that's probably a problem. the last thing I would say is in the enterprise segment is there's some companies that are legendary for enterprise sales, and those people that work there learn, right? In America, there's a company called PTC, which you probably never heard of. It's a software company in Boston, but they're legendary in enterprise sales. And so a lot of sales managers come from PTC. And there's other companies that do enterprise sales really well. And you want to really choose people from there. Now, SMB management is so different. It's all about numbers. It's about being in the office. It's about motivation. It's about, every day making progress. So I think they couldn't be more different. And SMB managers, enterprise managers rarely cross over from one to the other. Let me go back to the chat window. I think there's a few more questions there. Let's see. So Eric says, this is Eric at Arizona Company from Brazil. Who's the decision maker or prospect? IT, sales, or marketing? All of them, unfortunately. Our business sponsor is usually somebody in sales who owns the revenue from existing customers. So they're responsible for renewals and upsell. But IT usually is involved because Gainsight is complex, integrates with Salesforce, things like that. So IT is sort of not the decision maker, but almost a gatekeeper. And the decision maker is typically in sales. Next question from Alicante 7. How much patience should we have with a sales rep that isn't closing big deals? And like I said, I feel like we're all in the same boat because you're asking the same questions I have. If a sales rep has a big funnel but isn't closing big deals, I think you need a decent amount of patience. So you can't just do it based on 3 months or 6 months. But if I were you, I would meet those customers and I would see what they think of that rep. And if the customers are glowing about the rep and there's a real deal there and it's just taking a while, and you can attribute that or your manager can, that's awesome. But if the customers don't know the rep, or if the people the rep's meeting with are very junior, that's a problem. And a lot of sales reps that aren't good will create a lot of pipeline, but it's like one person that saw a demo once, right? If they're not meeting with the customers regularly face to face, that's not real pipeline. And like I said, I only know some of these because this is a pain I've been through. So like I said, I feel like you guys are going through the exact same things. Next question from Eduardo. How do you define a sales goal for a product? So I'm assuming they have multiple products. How do you define, for a new product? We're actually going through this now because we're starting to unbundle Gainsight. And you can say you can buy surveys on its own and things like that. And we're trying to figure out those goals. I don't think there's a magic answer, but I do think there's some sort of like laws of physics about how quickly new things can be sold. Your sales team is pretty, typically if you have multiple products, they're pretty busy on whatever they're selling. And it takes a while for them to learn the new things. I'll go on sales calls. I'm so annoyed. I was on one yesterday and I was with our SE, a nice SE, but he wasn't demoing 2 of our new features. And I was like, why aren't we demoing those features? And it's like, I guess it takes a while for people to really start demoing the new features. And so as a CEO, you probably think everyone is always up to date on everything, new products, but actually takes a while. So one way to think about it then is it's sort of a units-based model. In other words, some percent of your reps are going to sell a certain number of units in the first 90 days, but not all of your reps. So if you have a model where you're like, everyone's going to sell 10 of these in the first 90 days, that probably doesn't work. It's more like 25%, the most sophisticated reps are going to go to some of your earlier customers and sell this new product. There's going to be a few big deals, few small deals, things like that. Okay, let me go back. Another question from Q&A, actually in the chat window. Which reps are responsible for expansion existing customers? So in Mars, we have a rep that sells the new deal and a different rep that expands and renews the existing deal. That's called a customer